Hi everybody, I'm Eric. I'm here with Julian Stodd today, and today we're going to be talking about his book, The Humble Leader. And so I'm very excited about this concept. Actually, it's one of my favorite books in terms of structure, and I just want to jump right into it today. So Julian, can you tell me a little more about your background and how you became interested in the concept of humble leadership?
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me along. My background is rather varied. I originally trained as an archaeologist and material scientist, so my training was quite rigorous, a bachelor in science, and was leading me towards a kind of academic pathway. But I then got really interested in how people work. So I ended up shifting along into psychology and neurophysiology, thinking about how people work. And once I'd started down that track, life just got interesting and complicated. So my work around 2010 started describing a notion of the social age, a new context of our society, a new world in which we live in, and the new organizations that we need, and specifically the type of leadership we need in that world. Now, I still kept a scientific edge to my work, so I'm a researcher as well as a writer. And I was doing quite a lot of research around this subject, big research projects looking at trust, research projects looking at communities and how they operate, research looking at belief and how we believe in leaders. And this culminated in a program which I still run today called Quiet Leadership. Quiet Leadership talks about leadership in the smallest of actions. It was a little bit of an immune response I was having to a lot of leadership work that talks about a journey of 10,000 steps, big organizational programs, and an idea that leadership is something big and monumental. And I thought, well, maybe it is, but I want to write something about the first 3 steps of that journey. So the quiet leadership work is very simple and it's very gentle, and it looks at humility, kindness, fairness, and grace, the gracefulness of our actions. So I guided thousands of people through that work, and through the pandemic and through the lockdowns, people from nearly 50 different countries taking part in that program. And that led me through all of these conversations about humility. It's a funny subject because when we talk about humility, we sort of hide it away. It's not something we often talk about. In fact, I explore this in the introduction to the book to say, well, if I tell you that humility is important and you think it will help you be successful, you should be more humble. Surely that's the opposite of what humility actually is. But the other approach, where we say, well, humility is really important, but let's never talk about it, and you can't develop it or be more like it, well, that's going to get us nowhere. So the quiet leadership work gave me the opportunity to find a language. And the language I found was about our shadows. And it says, when we think about humility, it's like a reflection. We look in a mirror and we can see our face staring back at us in the light, and we see it in all this detail. I can see a few wrinkles, which are just, from smiling too much. I can see a few grey hairs, which is just the wisdom coming through. But reflection is one way of looking at ourselves. But behind me lies this shadow. The light that lets me see myself casts a shadow. And if I turn around to look into that shadow, I can't see into it. I can see these 2 cones of light going off to the side, but I can't see into the shadow. And as a leader, I operate in both spaces, in the light where I can see my reflection, and in the shadow where I can't. And that's a theme that I've explored in the quiet leadership work. And I got to a point where I thought, I really want to develop this idea further. But I was quite nervous about doing it. I wasn't nervous because I thought it would be difficult. I was nervous because I knew it would be difficult, because I'd already tried it a couple of times before. I'd done some early work in San Francisco on social justice, working with homeless communities. And I'd done further work looking at fairness and thinking about frameworks around that. And none of that writing had really gone anywhere. So I thought, if I want to produce a book about humility, It can't be a book with answers. It's not going to be a normal type of book with a lot of content and research and answers. It's going to be a reflective journey, a reflective space. And I thought furthermore, it can't really be anybody else's reflection. It's going to have to be my reflection. And so that's how I wrote it. It's a series of quite fragile sections exploring aspects of humility. And the work is shared more as space than content. The whole book is only just over 3,000 words long. It's got a lot of space in it. It's a very simple book, and I was determined to produce it as a beautiful artifact. It's only available as that small hardback book that you can read yourself, just dip into it anywhere, but reflect on it, or you could work on it with others. So it's a simple, fragile book at the end of quite a long journey of creation.
I love it. And to be honest with you, that is actually one of the favorite parts about this book too, because usually in any great engaging book, your mind drifts. And this is what it was designed to do. So the funny thing is, what you just said isn't the greatest segue into the next question, but we'll try to make it work, because I do think it's going to be useful. But what is one key takeaway or principle from your book that you believe will be most valuable for leaders to understand?
The takeaway from the book is, I'm going to give the most terrible answer to that question, is whatever you take away from it. In the introduction, I say...
That's what I thought.
You may love this book, or you may want to tear pages out of it. You can graffiti it. It is designed to be a book that you can write into it yourself. You know, literally, it has no answers, so you can't disagree with the answers, but you can certainly disagree with the premise or with the questions. It is shared as my reflection, with the utter certainty that it won't be your reflection. So that my sort of easy answer is to say, take out of it what you like, even if all you take out of it is that you hate it. At least you will have ruled out one thing that it may be, and maybe that will help you to find what your version of it could be. But there is a slightly different answer I could give you, which is to say that you could take out of it what brought you into it. I think people who pick this work up are interested in themselves and in their practice. And I've become quite interested in this notion of being in practice, not of being the best version of yourself, but in recognizing that we are all imperfect. In fact, leadership is imperfect. We're never going to master it. We're never going to be perfect. But what we can be is aware of our imperfection. And by taking the time to think about this, to explore, even if it's just 2 minutes or 3 minutes, to think about yourself, to think about others, to think about the system, to think about your intention and your action and your impact, then you are giving yourself the opportunity to step out of a busy day and to change the hardest thing of all, which is yourself. You know, most people are busy, and most people believe that they are a good version of themselves. In fact, I suspect the world is full of a lot of people who are the best version of themselves. But best is contextual. It's the self we see in the light. So this book, alongside some of my other work, really encourages people to recognize that. So it says, you know, when you hear the celebration, remember to turn away from the campfire and look into the dark, look into the shadows, and recognize that your leadership is experienced in both. So I think it is, as I've said, it's fragile work, it's gentle work, but I believe it's important work. In some ways, although this book is at the very softest end of my work, it's at the most extreme end. You know, most of my work is more heavily evidence-based, it's research-led, it often deals with difficult and challenging topics around failure and complexity and control and power, but this one doesn't. but in some ways, I think it might be the most important book I've written. It certainly took me the longest to write, even though it's the shortest to read. And I think that's because it took me a long time to feel safe enough to share it.
No, I could definitely appreciate that, Julian. It's I see what you mean in terms of both answers, right? It's whatever it is to you, but then also I could agree with the second option. I know, speaking to the structure of the book, you mentioned that it's short, that it's not many words, right? That going through it too, it's really designed, at least for myself, was like a workbook, right? Been jotting a lot of notes down, been structured. Have you seen this book structure before? Like, for somebody who's new to this concept or trying to imagine what this kind of book this is, what's a good example or an analogy that you can think of or compare it to?
Well, I mean, I'm sure there are books that are structured like this. That wasn't particularly my inspiration. I had actually tried something like this before. Well, I had tried a book before that was incomplete. I wrote a book called The Trust Sketchbook after I'd finished The Landscape of Trust Research. And it was hand illustrated, and it took 12 aspects of trust. And I wrote some questions and I created some illustrations which were all half complete. And so it was shared as a sketchbook. And it said, I've given my half of the story, what I can bring from the research and what I can bring in terms of structure, and you need to complete it. And I was also nervous about that work. I was so nervous to share that work that before I published it, I wrote a whole second book about trust called The Trust Guidebook that was far more directive. I mean, the clue is in the title. The sketchbook implies you can draw in what you like. The guidebook was just telling you, this is what the research is. This is how it looks. In fact, the Trust Guidebook has a subtitle, 72 Questions About Trust. It's a much safer book. It's a good book. But I found it interesting in myself why I felt the need to move to safety before I'd even published it. Before I'd even shared the work with people, I was nervous about, whether people would just pick it up and say, I just bought a book and there's nothing in it. It's like, where's the value in this work? And so I knew that I wanted to explore this. And when it came to the humble leader, you could say it was more an act of cowardice than anything else, because a core theme of this book is, how can we talk about humility? What a crazy thing to talk about. Is it even a thing? I mean, the book doesn't argue it is a thing. If anything, it says humility is probably just a judgment. It's the judgment of other people. And it just seemed right. In fact, the funny thing is, after I wrote it, before it went off to print, I had to have one more read through it. And I went to the cafe and I sat down to read it. And normally I hate doing this, I should say. I'm really, really bad at reading my own books. In fact, I hate doing it. But luckily, this one's so short, I could read it cover to cover in 15 minutes. And as I read it, I thought, I don't know how I wrote that. To me, I don't know if other people would see this. To me, the language is closer to poetry than it is to prose. It's a voice that I have not normally had. It reads differently than a lot of my other work. And the funny thing is, if somebody said to me, could you write an extra chapter in it? I'm not entirely sure I could. I think it's just of its moment. I was writing about it today, actually. It's like a season changing, the bud breaking on a tree, the blossom came, and then it's fallen to the ground. And by next year, it will be part of the soil. It was a moment that work came together. It might sound very grand. I mean, people might read it and not like it. I'm absolutely okay with that. Nowhere do I claim it's good. But the structure feels right. It is space. And the thing which I love is that I've just had hundreds of people sharing their notes, their questions. And they often share it with vulnerability. They often share it as they would share a secret. They show me books with post-it notes sticking out of them and bookmarks in it. Or sometimes they say, I've left the book pristine, but over here I've got a bit of paper that I've scribbled all over. Somebody I spoke to yesterday said, because the book is illustrated with leaves, which is a carryover actually from the quiet leadership work. Quiet leadership follows the growth of an acorn into an oak tree and through its cycle of seasons. So the leaves are in this book, but they're black and white. They're pen and ink. I drew them with architectural pens on paper. And they said, I go back to the book and I colour them in. That's my reflective practice. I colour the leaves in. And I kind of loved that. They made the book their own.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know initially I was hesitant to draw on it, to fold it, bookmark, anything, because it's a nice looking book. It's just refreshing to open.
Yeah.
But then I think it was when I was in a bad mood after a call with my team, and I realized that my behavior wasn't necessarily, it wasn't the ideal leadership, right? I wasn't necessarily addressing the team the way I should have been. And that's when I realized, and I just started drawing, like sketching, and I wasn't necessarily writing, but I was just thinking. And that's what's great about this book too, because I couldn't even get through a paragraph without thinking. Or what's great about this too is, and I don't know if this was your intent, but the first thing you see when you open the page is the large text. So that almost frames your mindset for the rest of what you're about to read. So I would read that, and then I would think, okay, immediately I have to distract and start thinking, when am I not doing this? Do I agree with the statement? And a lot of that was dependent on my mood. So I start reading it, and then I would just start thinking, okay, is this something that I'm good at? Or when it comes to, for example, the homeless, right? Like, how am I judging them? And I really liked or appreciated the fact that when it comes to wealthy people, humbleness is a privilege. So that simple message just had me thinking for a while, because it is a season, at least, this sounds weird, but it's a season of giving, right? We want to be more charitable, and it's something that I've been looking into. So just seeing people as they are was very useful. So I was really excited about this. Now, I wanted to wrap up this podcast, just 'cause I like to keep things short, very direct. What would your call to action be for readers, or actually people looking to buy this book, or people mildly interested?
I think my call to action would be to make yourself a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, and to have the time to sit down. You know, time is a luxury in the busy world that we're in. And, you know, as I said, this book is not the book if you're looking for an answer. That there are no answers in this book. There's quite a lot of uncertainty. But take control of something, and pretty much the only thing that we can easily take control of is a fragment of our time, a sliver of our time, and then choose how you will use it. So we live in a world where certainty holds power. And to really delve into this work, I think we have to create a space for uncertainty. You don't have to share that with anybody. It can be a private moment, but just a moment to pause with your tea or with your coffee and look at yourself. And that's really all this work is intended to do. You know, people can read it and judge it. They can even judge me within it. But ultimately, if you can give yourself a space of uncertainty, and even if it's just 5 or 10 minutes, just to look at yourself in safety, in the safety of your own head, and then just think, you know, is this how I want to be? Is this the shadow I want to cast on the landscape? Is this how I want to stand? How does my shadow land on others? Where do I bring the light? It's very simple. It's gentle work. It's not changing the world, but it just might give you the opportunity to think about yourself. And that's all I set out to do in it.
Love it. Julian, thank you so much. I appreciate the time.
If you want to continue learning about microlearning best practices, be sure to subscribe to our channel, The Microlearning Lab by Ninjatropic. We'll keep sharing the latest tips, tricks, and techniques to help you get the most out of your training programs.